core members, more great wisdom from Pope John Paul II's personal diary called In God's Hands. He says this, very important, in fact, brings us to the very heart of the gospel, brings us to the heart of what Christ came to show us, to offer us, and to teach us. Listen to this. Man cannot be just before God. He can only be justified before him. The key shift. We are always trying, in our broken humanity, in our pride, we are always trying to justify ourselves before God. This is the very essence of sin as Christ unfolds it for us in the New Testament. The attempt to justify ourselves before God. We cannot be just before God. We can only be justified by Him. Think of the parable of the two people who went to the temple to pray, right? This is the very essence of that parable. The tax collector bows down humbly in the back, can barely even lift his eyes to heaven, and he says, "Be merciful on me, a sinner." Whereas the Pharisee lists all the good things he does and is so grateful that he's not like this tax collector, right? But in listing all these great things he does, he's trying to be just before God. He's trying to justify himself before God. We cannot be just before God. We can only be justified by God before God. In other words, justification is a gift. It is a grace. It is not something that we earn, right? It's a painful lesson, and it really reorients our whole lives to get this correct. It reorients us from a position of fear because we're not doing enough, we're not good enough, to a position of abandonment and trust. I love what the little flower Saint Therese says here. She says, "I have resigned myself to find new imperfections in myself every day and to rejoice in finding them, because in finding them, I entrust myself all the more to God's mercy." We learn this delightful paradox in the lives of the saints. It's this: the more imperfect we realize we are, and opening those imperfections to God's grace, the closer we are to perfection. It's a crazy paradox. It's exactly the opposite of what we tend to think it is. We tend to think saints are perfect people. Saints are not perfect people. Saints are people who know they are perfectly loved in all their imperfections. You, my brother, you, my sister, you are perfectly loved in all your imperfections. Let that perfect love draw you closer to who you're meant to be. Peace.